Good evening, friend. Find a comfortable position and let the room go quiet. Wherever you are tonight, whatever the hour, you can let it go for a while. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the blanket settle. There is nowhere else you need to be right now except here, in this armchair, with me, in front of a fire that is burning low and steady. Tonight, we are going somewhere warm, which feels right for an evening meant for rest. We are going to a bathhouse on the coast of Italy, in a port town called Ostia, a little less than 2,000 years ago. And I promise you, by the time we get there, the heat of the place will have settled into your own body, the way a good bath does, slow and total, until you cannot quite remember what it felt like to be cold. Somewhere outside your own window right now, the world is doing whatever it does at this hour, indifferent to you, which is exactly the permission you need to stop paying attention to it for a little while. That is what this hour is for. Not solving anything, not planning tomorrow, just listening and letting the weight of the day settle out of your shoulders, the way sediment settles out of still water. Slowly, without any effort on your part at all. If you have a cup of something warm within reach, this is a good moment to hold it. Feel the heat through the ceramic or the glass and set it down again. No need to finish it. No need to do anything at all except listen. Some nights we visit kings. Tonight we are visiting almost the opposite of a king. A boy whose name barely survives in any record at all, which is precisely why his evening deserves an hour of our attention. The famous get remembered whether we tend to them or not. The rest of history needs us to come looking. I have spent a long time with this story, turning it over the way you might turn over a smooth stone found on a beach. And I think it is one of the gentler ones I have to tell you, even though parts of it are hard. History is like that sometimes. The hard parts, the gentle parts share the same room. I want to tell you about a building that most people have already pictured in some form, without ever having been told the truth of it. You have probably seen the paintings. Marble columns, steam curling off a pool, the color of pale jade. Men in togas discussing politics while their skin turns the color of good bread. It is a lovely image, and it is not entirely wrong. But it is only half the picture, and it is the easier half, which is why it is the half we usually get. Tonight, we are going to follow one young man through a single day inside one of these buildings in the year we would call 145, during the reign of the Emperor Antoninus Pius. His name was Threptus, and his job had nothing to do with soaking in warm water. His job was to make sure the water stayed warm for everyone else. If you ask most people what a Roman bathhouse's daily life looked like, they would describe a painting, marble and leisure, oil and idle conversation, the unhurried rhythm of men who had nowhere pressing to be. Tonight, we are going behind the canvas, down a narrow stone stairwell that most bathers in Ostia never noticed and certainly never used, into a world of brick pillars and choking wood smoke that made the marble world above possible. The version most people carry in their heads is the view from the warm pool. We are going to spend our evening in the view from underneath the floor. By the time we reach the end of this one day, I think you will never again picture a Roman bath the way you did before you pressed play. You will see the marble, yes, and the water, and the oiled skin of senators arguing about grain prices. But you will also see, without being told to look for it, the low ceiling of brick pillars underneath it all, and the boy who kept the whole beautiful illusion breathing. That is not a small thing to carry with you. It changes what luxury looks like, once you have seen what holds it up. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of evening that suits you, slow walks through old worlds instead of the noise of the present one, I would be glad if you took a moment to subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it helps this fire keep burning on my end, which means we get to keep meeting like this. If you want, tell me in the comments what city you are resting in tonight and what time it is where you are. I read every one, even the ones that come in long after the video has ended. Wherever you are, I am glad you found your way here, friend. We will spend some time in the marble rooms tonight, in the warm water and the scent of oil, because that world deserves to be seen too. But we will also stop more than once to step back from Threptus's day and look at the larger world holding it up, the money involved, the beliefs about health and status that made a building like this feel necessary in the first place, the slow changes already stirring beneath a society that still had centuries of its own story. None of it will rush. We have the whole night for this one day. Now, let us leave the present behind for a while and step into the past, because the past, tonight, is waiting for us with the fires already lit. It is the middle of the night in Ostia, though nobody in the furnace room below the baths of Neptune would call it night exactly, because down there, the hour has never mattered as much as the fire does. Somewhere above their heads, the marble floor of the caldarium is cold and silent, waiting for the heat that has not yet arrived. And in a small room beside the woodpile, a boy named Threptus is already awake. Ostia in the year 145 is not the Rome you are picturing. It is louder in some ways and quieter in others. This is the port town that feeds Rome, sitting where the Tiber River finally gives up its fresh water to the sea 16 miles downstream from the capital. Grain ships from Egypt and North Africa unload here by the hundred, their hulls low in the water with wheat bound for the capital's bakeries, and the town has grown fat and busy on the strength of that traffic. It smells like a working harbor. Salt water and tar from the ropes, fish drying on racks near the wharves, a peculiar sourness of grain dust that settles over everything near the warehouses, the great brick harria where the wheat waits in the dark before the wagons carry it up the road to Rome. Ostia had grown up around its harbor the way a tree grows around a fixed point, rings of warehouses closest to the water, then workshops and taverns serving the dock workers. Then the residential blocks stretching back toward the old Republican walls that no longer marked any real defensive boundary but still gave the street grid its shape. Temples to a whole crowded pantheon stood at intervals through the town, some dedicated to gods every Roman would recognize: Jupiter, Venus, Ceres, appropriate to a grain port, and others belonging to cults carried in on foreign ships. Persian Mithras worshipped in small underground chambers by soldiers and merchants who had encountered his cult somewhere along the empire's eastern frontier. A town this, dependent on trade-absorbed religions the way it absorbed languages, without much fuss, so long as the gods in question did not interfere with the shipping schedule. The streets are paved with tight-fitting stone, worn smooth and slightly grooved by generations of cartwheels, and if you walk them barefoot in the small hours of the morning, you would feel how cool a stone stays even after a hot day, holding on to the night's temperature the way the sea does. Ostia's buildings climb higher than you might expect. This is not a town of low villas and gardens. It is a town of insulae, brick apartment blocks, stacked 4 and 5 stories over shop fronts, with families crowded onto upper floors that sway faintly in strong wind and cost less rent the higher you climb, because higher floors meant longer stairs and more risk if fire ever took the building. A single ground floor room near the Forum might rent for a few hundred sestertii a year, if you had a trade worth protecting. A cramped upper room might run a poor family a fraction of that, which tells you plainly enough what kind of hierarchy was built into these buildings before anyone even moved in. Morning in Ostia begins before the sun does, because a port runs on tide and cargo schedules rather than anyone's comfort. Dock workers are already hauling amphorae of oil and wine off the ships by lamplight. Bakers have had their ovens going for hours, and the smell of baking bread drifts through the streets alongside wood smoke, mixed with the sharper smell of the public latrines, the forika, where 24 citizens might sit shoulder to shoulder on a long marble bench with a channel of running water beneath them and a sponge on a stick shared between users. A detail that tends to surprise people more than almost anything else about Roman daily life. There is nothing shy about ancient hygiene. Privacy, as we understand it now, was a luxury nobody here especially expected or even valued in the way we do. The season shapes all of this too. Early autumn in this part of Italy still carries most of summer's warmth in the daytime hours, the sea holding its heat long after the land begins to cool. But the nights have started turning noticeably crisper, cool enough that a heated floor feels like more than mere pleasure, closer to a genuine comfort worth paying a coin for. In a few months, the grain fleet would stop arriving altogether until spring. The harbour would grow quieter, and the whole town would settle into the slower rhythm of winter. For now, though, Ostia was still near the height of its yearly business. Ships crowding the river mouth, warehouses filling, the streets carrying more bodies and more noise than they would again until the following summer's fleet returned. By the time full daylight arrives, the streets fill with a version of crowd noise that would feel almost familiar to you. Vendors calling out prices for bread and vegetables and cheap wine. The clatter of a blacksmith's hammer somewhere off a side street. Mule carts groaning under the weight of cargo, forbidden from the streets during daylight hours in many towns of this era, because the traffic became unmanageable, which meant the loudest hauling happened at night instead, fact that would have made this exact pre-dawn hour, the hour we are about to spend with Threptus, considerably noisier outside than you might imagine. For the middle of the night, Ostia was, by the standards of its century, a remarkably mixed place. Sailors and merchants from every corner of the Mediterranean passed through its warehouses and its taverns, Greeks and Syrians and Africans and Spaniards, their languages layering over one another in the streets near the harbour, until Latin itself became just one voice among several. Gulls wheeled and shrieked over the wharves, competing with the creak of rigging and the shouted counts of dock workers measuring grain by the modius into sacks for the inland journey. A visitor from Rome itself might find Ostia almost foreign in its texture, saltier, rougher, more thoroughly a working town than the capital ever allowed itself to be, even as its temples and its baths and its theatre strained to look every bit as dignified as anything the capital could offer. A labourer here, an unskilled man hauling cargo or mixing mortar, might earn something in the range of 3 or 4 sestertii for a full day's work, roughly what a legionary soldier of this period took home per day once you divide his annual pay across the calendar. A loaf of bread from a corner bakery cost a fraction of 1 sestertius. Wine, the ordinary sour stuff that dock workers drank, rather than the vintages senators argued over, cost little more. It was possible to eat and drink modestly on very little money in Ostia, which is precisely why the town could sustain the enormous population of labourers, freedmen, and slaves who kept its harbour and its warehouses and its baths running every single day without any of it appearing to cost anything at all to the people who benefited from it. And near the centre of all this, not far from the Forum and the theatre, stood the Baths of Neptune. It had been under construction for years, commissioned under the Emperor Hadrian, and only recently finished under his successor, Antoninus Pius, its floors laid with a black and white mosaic of the sea god himself, driving a chariot of horses through waves. Surrounded by dolphins and sea creatures, rendered in such fine detail that visitors would stop simply to look down at their own feet. The building rose in a long rectangle of brick, faced with marble veneer near the entrances, its interior a sequence of vaulted rooms that echoed every footstep and every voice into something grander than it actually was. This was one of the largest public baths in a town of perhaps 50,000 people, and on any given afternoon it might receive hundreds of bathers moving through its rooms in the unhurried rhythm the empire had built its entire idea of leisure around. A bather moving through the building followed a sequence that had become, by this point in the empire's history, almost ritual in its familiarity. First, the apoditarium, the changing room, where a visitor undressed and handed their belongings to a capsarius. For safekeeping, the walls around them lined with small, shelved cubbies and painted in some bathhouses, with cheerful scenes of hunting or wine that had nothing to do with bathing at all, and everything to do with putting a nervous first-time visitor at ease. From there, many would pass through the palestra to stretch, wrestle, or toss a ball before the water, working up the kind of light sweat that Roman writers on health considered a useful prelude to what followed. Then came the rooms proper, the frigidarium first. For some, it's cold plunge pool bracing, enough to make a grown man gasp, or the tepidarium first for others, a gentler warmth meant to ease the body into the heat gradually rather than shock it. The caldarium came last for most, the hottest room in the building, its heated floor and steaming basin drawing out sweat that a bather would then scrape away with a curved strigil rather than wash away with soap, before retreating back through the cooler rooms in reverse, ending, often, back in the cold plunge for a final bracing shock that Roman physicians swore closed the pores and settled the humours. It was early autumn, the harvest ship still arriving, the days still warm enough that the marble floors of the frigidarium felt pleasant rather than punishing underfoot. Bathing in Ostia followed the rhythm of the whole town's day. Mornings were often set aside for women who paid a slightly higher entrance fee for the privilege of bathing before the heat of the afternoon brought the crowds. By midday, the doors opened wider for men of every station, from dock workers washing away a morning of cargo work to magistrates arriving with a slave to carry their oil flask and a second slave to guard their clothing. Admission cost a quadrans, the smallest coin the Roman mint produced, so small that children were sometimes let in for nothing at all. It was, by design, one of the few pleasures in the ancient world that a beggar and a senator might purchase for roughly the same price, even if what happened to them once they were inside looked nothing alike. Moat. From the street, you saw the entrance, a colonnade, a hint of the marble floor beyond. What you did not see, what almost nobody who came here to bathe ever thought to ask about, was how the floor beneath their bare feet came to be warm at all, hour after hour, day after day, regardless of the season. There was no visible fire anywhere in the bathing rooms, no hearth, no smoke, no sign of effort. The heat simply existed, radiating up from the floor and out from the walls as though the building itself had decided to be generous. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely. Once you understand where the effort actually went, it did not go missing. It went underground into a low crawl space beneath the bathing floor and a network of narrow flues inside the walls, a system the Romans called the hypercaust, and into the hands of a small number of people whose labor made the entire performance of luxury possible. We're going to meet one of those people now. Around the back of the baths of Neptune, past the delivery yard where cart after cart of split timber waited, stacked against a brick wall, a narrow doorway led down half a flight of worn stone steps into the service level, warren of storage rooms, a woodyard, and the low iron door of the praefurnium, the furnace mouth that fed the entire building its heat. It was here, in a cramped cell built into the wall beside the woodpile, barely large enough for a straw mattress and a wooden stool, that Threptus slept. Threptus was 17 years old, though nobody had ever marked the occasion of his birth with any special ceremony, and he himself only estimated the number by counting backward through the summers he remembered. His name was Greek in origin, meaning something close to nourished or raised, a name commonly given to enslaved children born into a household rather than purchased from outside it, and it suited him in a quiet, ironic way, since he had spent most of his short life feeding a fire. He was slight for his age, wiry rather than strong in any way that showed the kind of build the work itself had made, rather than one nature had given him. His hair had once been dark, and is now, at the roots, permanently grey with old ash that no amount of washing ever fully lifted. His hands told the clearest story of all. The palms hardened into something closer to leather. Small white scars scattered across the knuckles where hot brick or careless embers had marked him over the years. Each one a small, unremarked record of a labor nobody ever thought worth recording properly. He belonged, in the plain legal language of the time, to a freedman named Gaius Fabius Nicephorus, a former slave himself who had earned his own freedom 2 decades earlier, through years of careful saving as a household steward. Buying his way free with a peculium built coin by coin from the same kind of small trust his own former owner had once extended to him. He had gone on to build a modest fortune the way many freedmen of Ostia did, through trade and shrewd contracts, eventually accumulating enough standing in the town to bid successfully for the lease on a public building as prestigious. Nicephorus held the lease on the Baths of Neptune, a common arrangement in Roman towns where the local council owned the building but paid, or in some cases simply permitted, a private operator called a conductor to run it day to day in exchange for the entrance fees and the prestige of managing so visible a public institution. Nicephorus, in turn, owned or leased a small staff to keep the machinery of the place running, and Threptus was one of 6 people who worked the service level beneath the baths. Though only 3 of them, Threptus among them, worked the furnace itself with any regularity. The household, if you could call it that, consisted of the furnace crew's shared quarters, a row of narrow cells built into the service corridor, each barely large enough for sleeping. Threptus shared his portion of the corridor with an older man named Faustus, who had tended the fires of this bathhouse for 11 years and had the permanently reddened eyes and the rasping cough to show for it, and with a boy younger than Threptus named Callias, who had arrived only the previous spring and still flinched at the low ceiling of the crawl space the way Threptus himself no longer did. Above them, in the sense of authority rather than architecture, stood Avilicus, an overseer named Secundus, who answered to Nicephorus and who divided the labor of the day, kept the accounts of wood delivered and wood burned, and occasionally, on a good day, remembered that the men working under him. Faustus had come to the crew as a young man himself, sold into this line of labor after an injury cost him a position as a stable hand, and 11 years of smoke had left their mark on more than just his eyes. He rarely spoke of any life before the furnace room, though on quieter evenings he would sometimes hum a few bars of a tune Threptus did not recognize, something from wherever Faustus had lived before Ostia claimed him, and stop himself before it went any further, as though the melody belonged to a version of him no longer worth mentioning. Callias, still new enough to the work that his hands had not yet hardened the way Threptus's had, held on to a nervous habit of counting his own breaths whenever the crawl space narrowed, a private arithmetic that seemed to steady him more than any word of encouragement could. Threptus held a private opinion he had never spoken aloud to either of them, a small stubborn wonder that had never quite worn off despite years of familiarity with its cause. Steam to him still seemed faintly miraculous, the way plain water and ordinary fire could conjure something that filled a room and vanished the moment it touched cool air, leaving nothing behind but a damp sheen on stone. He had asked Faustus once, early in his time here, why it did that, and Faustus had only shrugged and said that was simply what water did when you made it angry enough. Threptus had never quite believed that explanation, and some part of him continued turning the question over in whatever spare moment his mind was permitted to wander. Here is a detail that tends to surprise people, and it is worth pausing over before we go further. Threptus was teaching himself to read. He had no tutor, no wax tablet of his own, no patient household scribe correcting his hand the way a wealthy citizen's son might have had. What he had was ash, an enormous, unclaimed supply of it, swept each evening into a corner of the woodyard before being carted away, and a broken length of iron rod he had found and kept hidden beneath his mattress. In the last light of evening, before Secundus made his final rounds, Threptus would smooth a patch of ash flat with his palm and trace the letters he had picked up here and there, a name overheard from a passing scribe, a word he had seen chalked on an amphora in the delivery yard, a numeral he had watched Secundus write into the wood ledger enough times to copy from memory. He had no plan for what this skill might become. He only knew, in the private, half-formed way, that a 17-year-old might know such a thing, that a man who could read a ledger was a man who might one day be trusted to keep one, and a man trusted to keep a ledger was a man closer to the kind of freedom. This is one of the small human truths that rarely survives in the record of a life like his, because nobody thought to write it down at the time. Slaves who kept careful books, slaves who managed household finances, slaves who eventually purchased their own freedom with savings called a peculium. All of this was common enough in Roman society that nobody found it remarkable. What was remarkable, if you stop to consider it honestly, is that a boy crawling through smoke and brick dust for 12 hours a day found the energy at the end of it to want something more than rest. The cell the three of them shared, if it deserves even that modest a name, was carved directly into the thickness of the service corridor wall, its brick still faintly warm to the touch at all hours. From the fire on the other side of it, a strange comfort in winter and a genuine misery in the height of summer. A single small vent near the ceiling let in air, the faintest grey suggestion of daylight, never enough to read by even if Threptus had owned anything worth reading. 3 straw mattresses lay along the floor, a wooden stool that had lost one leg and been propped permanently against the wall, and a shelf holding what little the three of them owned between them, a spare tunic each, a comb, a small clay lamp, and tucked behind a loose brick that only Threptus knew to look for, his iron writing rod. Today was, in most outward respects, an ordinary day for Threptus. The baths opened as they always did, closed as they always did, and the fires needed exactly the attention fires. But an ordinary day at the baths of Neptune was never quite as simple as it sounds, and today carried one complication that Secundus had already warned the furnace crew about the evening before. A section of the hypocaust floor near the caldarium's eastern wall had begun to sag, a sign that one or more of the brick pillars supporting the floor above had shifted or cracked under the weight of the marble and the water and the centuries of foot traffic pressing down from above. It would need to be inspected today, crawled to, examined by feel in near total darkness, and, if the crew was unlucky, repaired before the afternoon crowds arrived and put their full weight on a floor that might not hold it. There was, in fact, a kind of schedule that governed Threptus's existence, even if nobody had ever written it down for his benefit. It lived in Secundus's wax tablet, a shallow wooden frame filled with blackened wax that the overseer scored with with a bone stylus each evening, tallying wood delivered against wood burned, noting which sections of the hypocaust needed attention, marking the days a delivery of timber was expected from the wood contractors outside town. Threptus had never been shown this tablet directly, only glimpsed it over Secundus's shoulder during their brief exchanges, but he had come to recognize certain shapes on it: the numeral for the wood count, the abbreviation Secundus used for his own name, and increasingly, in recent months, the beginnings of other words as well. Gathered the same patient way, he gathered everything else worth having, a little at a time, without anyone giving him permission to want it. Secundus kept no formal schedule for his crew beyond the wood ledger, but the rhythm of the day was fixed all the same, dictated entirely by the building above, rather than by anything as generous as a clock. The fires had to be built high enough, hours in advance, that the floor and walls could reach a comfortable heat by the time the doors opened to women in the late morning. They had to be maintained at that heat without faltering through the entire span of the afternoon, when the crowd was largest and the demand on the water heaters was constant. And they had to be banked down, carefully, gradually, in the evening, so that the whole enormous machine of pillars and flues and bronze boilers could cool without cracking overnight. Threptus had learned the shape of this rhythm the way a person learns the shape of a room in the dark, by memory and repetition, rather than by sight, because sight, in the space where he spent most of his waking life, was rarely available to him at all. It is the 4th hour of the night, by the Roman reckoning, the stretch of darkness that falls somewhere close to what we would call 3 in the morning. Threptus wakes without needing to be woken, the way a body learns to do when the same hour claims it every day of its life. There is no window in his cell to tell him the hour by light, because there is no light yet to tell by. He knows it instead by the specific quality of the silence outside, the absence of the last night wagons that rumble past the delivery yard until the small hours, and by the ache that has settled into his shoulders and knees overnight, an ache that never fully leaves him, but that sleep dulls just enough to make bearable again each morning. He eats standing up, because sitting invites the temptation to lie back down. Breakfast is a heel of yesterday's bread, dense and a little stale, dipped in a cup of watered wine to soften it. The same meal Faustus and Callias are eating a few feet away in the dim light of a single oil lamp. There is no ceremony to it. A wealthy Roman further up the social ladder might take a light morning meal of bread and honey and think little of it, might not eat again until midday, and might consider this restraint a mark of good discipline. Threptus eats the same way out of necessity rather than virtue, because there will be no time to eat again until the fires are drawing properly, and the worst of the morning's labor is behind him. It sits behind the service corridor, walled on 3 sides, open to the sky on the 4th, and even in darkness, Threptus knows its layout by feel, the stacked cords of split oak and pine along the near wall, the older, drier wood kept separate for the initial lighting, the green wood pushed to the back where it can season for weeks before it is dry enough to burn cleanly. A large bathhouse like the Baths of Neptune consumes an extraordinary quantity of fuel every single day. Cart after cart of it, delivered by contract from woodlots outside the city that have been slowly, steadily stripped of timber over the years to keep pace with the appetite of Ostia's public baths. Threptus and Callias haul the first loads by hand, armful after armful, down the half-flight of stone steps to the low iron door of the Praefernium, stacking it within reach of the fire mouth, so that Faustus, whose job this morning is to tend the first flames, can feed the growing blaze without breaking his rhythm. The Praefernium itself is a brick archway barely taller than a grown man, opening onto a firebox beneath a great bronze cauldron called the testudo, shaped like the curved shell of a tortoise. which is where the actual water for the baths is heated before it circulates through pipes into the pools above. Faustus builds the fire in careful stages, kindling first, then the dry oak, coaxing the flame taller and hotter, until it roars in a way that makes conversation between the three of them nearly impossible without shouting. The light it throws is the only light down here, orange and shifting, throwing enormous shadows of ordinary men doing ordinary work onto brick walls, blackened by 11 years of the same fire, night after night, since long before Threptus arrived. Now here is where most people get this wrong, if they picture this scene at all. They imagine one fire, one furnace, a single dramatic blaze that heats an entire building, the way a hearth heats a room. The reality is a network, patient and mechanical rather than dramatic. The heat from the prefernium does not simply warm the water in the testudo. It also flows sideways and upward, drawn by careful design through the open space beneath the entire bathing floor, a crawl space called the hypercaust, held up on hundreds of short-stacked brick pillars called pilae, each one roughly 2 feet tall. Spaced in careful rows, like a forest of stone tree stumps that a person can only move through, bent nearly double or on hands and knees. From there, the hot air is drawn further still, up through hollow rectangular clay pipes called tubuli, set into the walls themselves, venting eventually through the roofline so that the walls of the caldarium grow warm to the touch. And a bather standing in the room above feels heat radiating from every surface around them without ever seeing a single flame. It is into this crawl space that Threptus goes next, once the fire is drawing well enough that Faustus can manage it alone for a while. He goes on his hands and knees, a leather apron tied over his tunic to protect what little clothing he owns from the worst of the ash, a rag wrapped over his nose and mouth that does almost nothing against smoke this thick. The space beneath the caldarium floor is perhaps 20 inches high in most places, low enough that even a boy of 17 must move through it, like something crawling rather than walking, dragging a small wicker basket behind him to gather the ash, broken brick fragments that collect between the pillars overnight. The air down here is not simply warm. It is heavy, thick with wood smoke that has nowhere better to go before it finds the tubuli, and it presses against the lungs in a way that makes every breath feel slightly stolen. Threptus has learned the hard way to breathe shallow and slow through the rag, rather than gasping, because gasping only invites more smoke. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told, and it deserves a moment of your attention rather than a quick pass. The comfort experienced by a bather standing upright in warm sandals on a heated marble floor exists because a person the size of a child is, at that very hour, folded nearly in half in the dark beneath that same floor, breathing air thick enough to taste, clearing the ash that the previous day's fire left behind so that today's fire can burn clean. Nobody upstairs will ever see this. Nobody upstairs is meant to. The entire architecture of the building, the marble veneer, the mosaic floors, the vaulted ceilings, exist partly to be beautiful and partly to make sure that beauty never has to share a room with the labor underneath it. Threptus reaches the sagging section near the eastern wall that Secundus warned the crew about, and he feels his way along the base of 3 pilae stacks with his fingertips before he finds the problem, a crack running through the mortar joint of the lowest brick, kind of small failure that could worsen under the weight of 100 bathers standing above it later today. He cannot repair it alone, not properly, not in the dark, with the tools he has on hand, so he backs out the way he came, careful not to disturb the weakened stack further, to report what he has found to Secundus before the doors open. He emerges into the service corridor, filthy in a way that soap and water, on the rare occasions he has access to either, can never fully undo. Ash has worked itself into the creases of his knuckles, into the rins of his ears, into the fine lines around his eyes where sweat has cut pale tracks through the grime on his face. He does not have time to think much about his own appearance. Secundus is waiting, wax tablet in hand, already noting the wood consumed against the wood delivered, and Threptus reports the cracked pillar stack in the flat. Practical language the two of them have developed for this kind of exchange, the language of people who have long since stopped expecting sympathy and have settled instead for being heard. Secundus receives the news the way he receives most news, without much visible reaction, though he does make a note on the tablet and mutters something about sending word to Nicephorus if the crack worsens. It is a small moment, easy to miss, but it tells you something true about how this hierarchy actually worked day to day. Secundus was not cruel. He was simply a man positioned between people with less power than himself and people with more, absorbing pressure from above and redistributing labor below, doing his job the way an overseer's job has always been done, in every century, in every system built. The morning presses on. More wood must be hauled before the doors open, the boilers checked. A second pass through part of the crawl space to clear ash from the section nearest the frigidarium, where the water is meant to stay cool rather than heated. Here, the crew's task shifts from fire to plumbing, checking the lead pipes, made of the same soft grey metal the Romans called plumbum, that carry fresh water into the cold pool. The architect Vitruvius, writing generations before Threptus's time, had already warned that water carried too long through lead tasted worse than water carried through simple earthenware, and had recommended terracotta pipes, wherever practical advice that grand public buildings like the Baths of Neptune only partly followed. Since lead was easier to shape around corners and cheaper to install across the long runs, a building this size required. Threptus knew none of Vitruvius's writing, of course, only that the pipe joints needed checking for slow leaks that would otherwise waste water the aqueduct had carried a considerable distance to deliver, and that this small, unglamorous inspection was as much a part of his morning as the fire itself. Threptus works through all of it with the practiced economy of motion that 11 months of this labor have taught him. No wasted effort, no wasted breath, because both are in short supply down here, and neither replenishes itself quickly. By the time the first pale grey of dawn reaches the delivery yard above, visible only in the thin strip of sky Threptus catches when he carries a load of ash out to the cart waiting to haul it away. The building above him has already begun to stir. Slaves belonging to the bath's cleaning staff are wiping down the marble benches of the appetitorium, the changing room, sweeping the floor of the palastra, the open exercise yard, where bathers will stretch and wrestle and oil themselves before ever entering the water. Somewhere above, a door is unbolted. The Baths of Neptune are opening for the day, first to the women of Ostia, who have paid their higher fee for the privilege of an earlier, quieter hour, and Threptus, standing in the yard with ash on his hands and smoke still sitting in his chest, will not see a single one of them enter. Before we follow Threptus into the rest of his morning, there is something worth understanding about the economics that built the world around him, because none of what we have just watched happened by accident or by simple cruelty. It happened because someone had worked out, carefully and deliberately, exactly what a bathhouse cost to run, and exactly who would bear each part of that cost. The numbers are worth pausing over. Public bathing in a town like Ostia was rarely a profit-making venture in the way a shop or a workshop might be. The quadrans that Threptus's fellow slaves collected at the entrance, the smallest denomination the Roman mint produced, brought in only a trickle of income compared to what the building actually cost to operate. The gap was filled, in most Roman towns, through a practice historians now call Yorgetism, a tradition of wealthy citizens and sometimes the town council itself funding public buildings and public services as a form of civic generosity that brought the giver prestige, political goodwill, and often a carved inscription naming them as benefactor for anyone who cared to look up and read it. Nicephorus, as the man who leased the operation, took on the burden of covering the daily costs, the wood, the wages of his small staff, the upkeep of the boilers and pipes, in exchange for whatever profit remained once the entrance fees and any side income, oil sales, towel rentals, and the small transactions of the palastra had been counted. Wood was the largest and most relentless expense. A bathhouse, the size of the baths of Neptune, burned through cart after cart of timber daily sourced from woodlots increasingly far from the city, as the closer forests were cut down over the decades to keep pace with Ostia's appetite for heated water. This was not unique to Ostia. Across the empire, the rise of public bathing as a near-universal civic institution quietly reshaped the countryside around every major town, as forests that had stood for generations were steadily converted into fuel for furnaces that most of the people enjoying the heat never thought about at all. It is one of the odder truths of Roman civilization that an institution built around cleanliness and leisure left behind, in its wake, a landscape of stripped hillsides that nobody at the time connected to the marble floors they so admired. Human labor, by contrast, cost Nicephorus almost nothing at all, and this is the detail that deserves the most attention tonight. A free laborer hired to haul cargo on the docks might expect 3 or 4 sestertii for a day's work, a wage roughly comparable to what a legionary soldier took home once his annual pay was divided across the calendar. Threptus received no wage whatsoever. He was property purchased or born into Nicephorus's household, and his labor belonged entirely to his owner, which meant that the single largest recurring expense any other business owner in Ostia would have faced, the cost of paying the people who did the work, simply did not exist on Nicephorus's ledger, where Threptus and Faustus and Callias were concerned. Their food, a small daily allowance of bread and wine, and occasionally a bit of oil or cheese, cost Nicephorus perhaps a few asses a day per person, fraction of what a free laborer's wage would have run him. It was from a purely commercial standpoint an extraordinarily efficient arrangement, and it is precisely that efficiency, cold and unremarkable to the people who benefited from it, that made the entire system of slavery so durable for so long. Threptus himself, as a piece of property rather than a person in the eyes of the law, had a price, and it is worth sitting with that fact for a moment rather than rushing past it. A young unskilled male slave in this period might sell for somewhere in the range of 500 to 2,000 sestertii, depending on health, age, and any useful skill he happened to possess, a sum roughly equivalent to a year or more of a free laborer's entire wage. A slave with a trade, a scribe, a skilled cook, a trained physician's assistant, could fetch many times that figure. Threptus, young and without any formal skill beyond the brute stamina the furnace room demanded, sat toward the lower end of that range, which is its own quiet, uncomfortable fact about how thoroughly this economy had learned to price a human being down to the sestertius. Clothing tells a similar story from the other direction. A toga of good wool, the garment a citizen like Priscus wore to mark his status whenever he left his house, could cost several hundred sestertii. Once you accounted for the wool, the dyeing, and the labor of the tailor who draped and stitched it to the exacting folds custom demanded. Threptus owned one tunic, coarse and undyed, patched more than once at the hem, worth perhaps a handful of sestertii new, and worth considerably less now after a year of ash and heat had done their work on the fabric. The distance between those two garments more than almost anything else in Ostia, announced at a glance which side of this economy a person occupied before they ever opened their mouth to speak. This did not mean Threptus had no path forward at all, and it is worth resisting the temptation to flatten his situation into pure hopelessness, because the reality was more complicated and in its own way more interesting. Roman slaves, especially those in urban households and skilled trades, were often permitted to accumulate a small personal fund called a peculium, technically still their owner's property but treated in practice as the slave's own savings, built up through small gifts, tips, or side work performed in whatever scraps of free time existed. A capsarius who guarded the changing room might receive a coin from a grateful patron whose belongings he had kept safe. A slave with a useful skill, bookkeeping, hairdressing, medicine, might be lent out to other households for a fee that partly found its way back to him. Enough peculium, saved over enough years, could eventually purchase a slave's own freedom, a practice called manumission that was common enough across the empire that a significant portion of the free population of any Roman town, including many of the shopkeepers and tradesmen Threptus passed in Ostia's streets, had once been enslaved themselves or were the children of someone who had. For Threptus, this meant his slow, self-taught letters in the ash of the woodyard were not simply an idle hobby. They were, however, faint the odds, an investment. A furnace slave who could read a delivery ledger, who could check Secundus's accounting against the wood actually stacked in the yard, was marginally more valuable than one who could not. And marginal value was sometimes the difference between a life spent entirely in the crawl space and a life that eventually moved upstairs into the more visible, less physically ruinous work of managing a household's accounts. It was a narrow door, and most who tried it never passed through it. But it was there, and Threptus knew it was there. And knowing it was there mattered more to him than any of us, sitting comfortably tonight, might easily appreciate. It is worth setting the quadrants against a few other prices of the day, just to feel its true weight. A seat at the theatre for an afternoon of comedy might cost a similar small coin or two. A cup of the cheapest wine from a street stall cost about the same. A loaf of bread ran, perhaps, twice that. Set against these, an afternoon at the Baths of Neptune, with all its heated water and marble and company, was a genuine bargain, arguably the single best value any resident of Ostia could purchase, with a coin that small, which goes some distance toward explaining why the institution commanded such deep civic loyalty across every level of society that could scrape together the fee. Nicephorus understood this loyalty as clearly as anyone. Running the baths at a thin margin, sometimes at no real profit at all once wood and staff were accounted for, bought him something the ledger could not easily capture, standing in the town, gratitude from the council that had granted him the lease, and the quiet, durable prestige of being known as the man who kept Ostia's water warm. The oil that bathers use to clean themselves is worth a moment too, because it connects the world above to the world below in a way that is easy to miss. Romans did not use soap in the way we understand it. Instead, bathers coated their skin in olive oil, worked it into the pores in the heat of the tepidarium and caldarium, and then scraped it away along with the day's grime using a curved metal tool called a strigil, a practice called defrictio that left the skin smooth and faintly glossy. Good oil, scented with herbs, cost enough that wealthier patrons brought their own in small flasks carried by a slave. Cheaper, unscented oil was sold at the baths themselves for those who had not brought their own, and the profit from those small sales, coin by coin, quadrans by quadrans, helped Nicephorus offset the relentless cost of the wood burning steadily beneath everyone's feet. For Threptus, none of this oil, none of this luxury was ever meant for him. He cleaned himself on the rare evenings he had both the time and the energy to bother with plain water and whatever oil scraps the crew was permitted to keep from broken or half-empty flasks discarded upstairs. It was a small, almost accidental mercy, the kind of thing nobody planned as generosity and nobody upstairs ever noticed as its absence. But it was the closest Threptus ever came to sharing in the luxury his own labor made possible for everyone else in the building. One more figure belongs in this accounting, easy to overlook, because he never appears in person, and that is the town council itself. Ostia's magistrates, Priscus among them, proved Nicephorus's lease in the first place, and in doing so, they were making a calculated political investment as much as a practical one. A well-run public bath reflected well on the men who had granted its lease, evidence of civic health and good governance that cost the council itself almost nothing in coin, while returning steady goodwill among the voting citizens who used the building daily. This is a pattern worth remembering because it recurs constantly across Roman civic life. Public goods were rarely funded out of pure altruism. They were funded because visible generosity, real or merely administered, was one of the most reliable currencies of political power the ancient world had ever devised. Let us return to him now, because the morning is not finished, and there is more of his day still ahead of us. It is nearing the 5th hour of the day, close to what we would call 11 in the morning, and above Threptus's head, the rhythm of the building has begun to change. The women's session is winding down. Soon, the attendants will ring the building's bronze signal disc to mark the changeover, and the crowd that flows through the doors of the baths of Neptune will shift from the wives and daughters of Ostia's merchant families to the men, dockworkers, and shopkeepers and magistrates alike, all arriving within the same short window because the afternoon was, for most of them, the one stretch of the day genuinely set aside for something other than work. This changeover means one thing to Threptus and Faustus and Callias. The fires must climb. Whatever heat has comfortably carried the morning's smaller crowd will not be enough for the crush of bodies about to fill the caldarium, each one pulling warmth from the water, the walls, simply by being present, and so the crew feeds the Pryphonium harder, stacking fresh timber in quicker succession. Watching the testudo's water begin to churn faintly at a rolling simmer rather than a gentle warmth. Sweat runs freely down Threptus's back, now cutting fresh tracks through the ash already settled there, and the heat, down here, always considerable, becomes something closer to punishing. This is the hour Secundus has chosen for the pillar repair, and it falls, as most difficult tasks in this crew's life tend to fall, to Threptus and Faustus together. They carry fresh mortar mixed in a small clay bucket, 3 replacement bricks wrapped in a rag to keep them from knocking together and giving away their position to bathers overhead who might wonder at the sound, and a short iron bar for prying loose what remains of the cracked pillar. The crawl to the eastern section takes longer than it should. Both men slow by the buckets and bricks they cannot easily maneuver through a space built for nothing wider than a person's shoulders. By the time they reach the damaged stack, the heat down here has climbed high enough that Faustus, after 11 years of this work, pauses twice, simply to breathe. They work by feel more than by sight. Threptus holding a small oil lamp angled away from his own eyes, so it does not blind him in the dark, while Faustus's hands, cracked and calloused past any sensation of pain, find the crumbling mortar joint and begin working the damaged brick free. It comes away in pieces rather than whole, which Faustus reads as a bad sign, evidence that damp had gotten into the joint at some point in the past and slowly eaten at it from the inside. The kind of hidden decay a person only discovers once it has already become urgent. They set the new brick, pack fresh mortar around it with fingers rather than any proper trowel, since there is no room down here to swing a trowel with any accuracy. and hold the joint steady for a slow count that Threptus keeps under his breath, a habit from counting numerals in the ash that he has started without quite noticing, to use for other things as well. The world directly above them at this exact moment is not what you likely picture either. Most imagine the bathing rooms of a Roman bath as places of hushed, contemplative quiet, marble halls where senators murmured philosophy to one another over the gentle lapping of water. The reality, as more than one Roman writer complained at the time, was considerably louder than that. A philosopher named Seneca, writing about a century before Threptus's day, once described living above a public bath and cataloguing its noise in a letter to a friend: the grunts of men lifting weights in the exercise yard, the slap of a masher's hands against oiled skin, the shriek of someone being plucked of unwanted hair by a hair remover who advertised his services by shouting, the splash and shout of swimmers in the cold pool, and beneath it all, weaving through the crowd, the cries of food vendors selling sausages and pastries and cheap wine to bathers who had worked up an appetite. The baths of Neptune on this particular afternoon would have sounded much the same, a wall of overlapping human noise bouncing off marble and vaulted brick until it became to anyone standing inside it less like a library and more like a marketplace that happened to have water in it. Threptus hears almost none of this directly, muffled as it is by 2 feet of packed floor and the roar of his own fire. But he has been up in the service corridors often enough, delivering fresh oil flasks or hauling out ash buckets through the narrow side door near the palastra to know the sound well from those brief glimpses of the world above. It was during one such errand, not this particular afternoon, but often enough to have become a small, reliable comfort, that a Capsarius named Rufus, a slave a few years older than Threptus, who guarded the clothing chests in the apoditerium, had taken to slipping him a heel of bread or a swallow of watered wine when their errands happened to cross paths near the side door. It cost Rufus nothing he would miss, and it meant, on the days it happened, that Threptus's stomach did not have to wait quite so long for the evening meal. Neither of them ever spoke about it directly. It was simply a thing that happened, quietly, between 2 people who understood without saying, so that kindness offered without witnesses was often the only kind either of them could safely offer at all. There is a moment, brief and easy to miss, where Threptus's errand with the ash bucket takes him past the narrow gap beside the side door, and through it he catches the smallest sliver of the frigidarium beyond, a rectangle of pale blue water lit from an opening in the roof above. A shaft of daylight, falling clean and unbroken, onto marble the color of good cream. He has seen this same sliver of view perhaps 100 times by now, and it has never once stopped catching something in his chest, a small, wordless pull toward a room he has delivered water to and cleared ash beneath, but has never once, in 11 months at this bathhouse, been permitted to enter as anything other than a service body moving quickly through its edges. He does not resent this exactly. It has simply always been true. The way the ceiling above the crawlspace has always been low, a fact of his world rather than a fresh injury each time he notices it. He shifts the ash bucket to his other hip and moves on before anyone upstairs notices him lingering. The repair holds. Faustus tests it with the flat of his palm, feeling for any give in the brick, and finds none, and the 2 of them begin the slow crawl back toward the Profernium, dragging the empty mortar bucket and the leftover brick behind them. It is, by any measure that matters down here, a good outcome. The floor above will hold the weight of however many bathers the afternoon brings, and nobody standing on it will ever know how close it came that morning to giving way beneath them. Above, at almost exactly this hour, a man named Lucius Aemilius Priscus, a magistrate on the town council, and one of the men who had originally approved Nicephorus's lease on the bathhouse, is standing in the tepidarium discussing the price of imported grain with two colleagues. His bare feet planted comfortably on marble that has been warm since before dawn, warm in a way he has never once, in all his years of bathing here, thought to question. He mentions in passing that the floors of this particular building seem finer than most, evenly heated, no cold patches the way some of the older baths in Rome suffer from near their edges. His companions agree. None of them will ever learn how narrowly that evenness was preserved this very afternoon by two enslaved men crawling on their stomachs through smoke thick enough to chew, holding a joint of fresh mortar steady with nothing but their fingers. There is more to understand here in simple contrast, though the contrast alone is worth sitting with for a moment. The entire experience Priscus is having right now, the sense of ease, the freedom to think about grain prices rather than about his own physical comfort, exists because that comfort has been made invisible to him. He does not experience the heat as labor because the system was built brick by brick and pillar by pillar, specifically to prevent him from ever having to. That is not an accident of architecture. It is the entire point of it. It is worth pausing on Callias for a moment, because the assumption a modern listener might carry that a boy his age had no business doing this kind of labor at all would have struck nearly everyone in Ostia as a strange thing to say. Roman childhood, for a slave, ended early and without ceremony. Callias had begun hauling wood almost as soon as he arrived the previous spring, and nobody, not Secundus, not Nicephorus, not even Callias himself, regarded this as anything but ordinary. Threptus had started the same way, at roughly the same age, and Faustus younger still. The correction here is not that this labor was uniquely cruel to children specifically, though it plainly was hard on a growing body, but that an entire civilization organized itself around the assumption that childhood was a luxury only certain households could afford their sons and daughters. That assumption rarely troubled anyone enough to write it down as worth questioning. Threptus, back at the Prefernium, allows himself a small, private pleasure once the crawl is finished. Standing upright for the first time in what feels like an hour, his spine cracking audibly as it straightens. The cool air near the woodyard's open side almost unbearably good against his overheated skin. He drinks from a water jug kept near the fire mouth, wipes his face with a rag that only smears the ash rather than removing it, and glances toward Callias, who has spent the last hour alone tending the fire, and looks it, his young face streaked with soot and sweat in equal measure. There is no time to rest properly. The afternoon crowd is only building, and somewhere above them, the bronze signal disc has already rung twice more, marking the busiest stretch of the day, still fully ahead of all three of them. Let us stop here for a moment and talk about the rules that governed who bathed, when, and beside whom, because they are woven through everything we have been watching, and they explain why a building that charged almost nothing at the door could still sort its visitors as carefully as any private club. The quadrant's entrance fee has a way of sounding almost egalitarian when you first hear about it. A coin so small that a dock worker and a magistrate paid roughly the same price to walk through the same doors. In one sense, this was true, and it was part of what made public bathing such a beloved civic institution across the empire. A rare shared pleasure that cut, briefly, across the sharp lines of Roman class. But the equality mostly ended at the entrance. Wealthier patrons like Priscus arrived with an entourage, sometimes 2 or 3 slaves apiece, one to carry oil and a strigil, one to guard clothing more closely than any communal capsarius could manage, one simply to fetch refreshments from the vendors circling the palastra. A dock worker, bathing on the same afternoon, came alone, trusted his tunic to the communal chest and to whichever capsarius happened to be on duty, and left when he was finished, rather than lingering for the hours a wealthy patron might spend moving unhurried between rooms while conducting the day's business. Theft, unsurprisingly, was a real and constant concern in the epiditarium, the changing room, and it is one of the more practical reasons that capsari existed at all. Roman inscriptions and legal texts from this period record real anxiety about clothing, thieves working the baths, men who would slip in among the crowd, claim an unwatched pile of tunics as their own, and vanish before the owner noticed. A slave like Rufus, guarding the chests, was performing genuine skilled labor, watching faces, remembering which garments belonged to which bather, intervening before a theft rather than after one, and a good capsarius was valued and occasionally rewarded for exactly this vigilance, which is part of why the small kindnesses that passed between him and Threptus mattered as much as they did. Trust, in a world with this little formal security, was worth quite a lot. The segregation of bathing hours, women in the morning, men in the afternoon, was common though not universal across the empire, and it reflected a broader Roman discomfort with mixed nudity that had, by Threptus's lifetime, hardened into something closer to policy in many towns. The Emperor Hadrian, who had begun construction of the very building Threptus worked beneath, is recorded as having restricted mixed bathing during his reign, formalizing a separation that some baths had already practiced informally. Since mixed bathing continued to happen in various forms and various places despite official disapproval, Ostia's own arrangement, morning for women, afternoon for men, was one solution among several the empire tried, none of them perfectly consistent from one town to the next, all of them reflecting an anxious negotiation between a genuine popularity of communal bathing. Like. Not everyone in Ostia relied on a public bathhouse at all, and this too is part of the class picture worth understanding. The very wealthiest households, the ones who could afford their own private cistern and their own small furnace, sometimes maintained a modest balneum of their own within the house, a private bathing suite scaled down from what a public building, like the Baths of Neptune, offered, but sparing its owner the indignity, as some saw it, of undressing among strangers. Priscus was not quite wealthy enough for this himself, which is one small reason he counted himself, without ever quite admitting it aloud, fortunate to have a public bath as fine as the Neptune so near his own door. The presence of these private alternatives for the very rich meant that the public baths, for all their genuine popularity, were never used equally across every rung of society. The poorest bathed there because they had no other choice. The middling classes bathed there because it was excellent value and good company besides. The richest bathed there when it suited them, and quietly maintained the option of never having to if it did not. Education followed a similarly uneven pattern, and it explains something about why Threptus's quiet project in the ash mattered as much as it did. A wealthy citizen's son in Ostia might have his own pedagogus, a household tutor, often himself a Greek slave, valued precisely for his learning, guiding him through letters and rhetoric from an early age as a matter of course. A slave born into a working household had no such path laid out for him at all. Literacy among the general population of the Roman world remained the exception rather than the rule, concentrated heavily among the wealthy, their household staff, and those in trades where reading and reckoning were simply unavoidable: merchants, scribes, certain skilled craftsmen. For someone in Threptus's position to acquire even a partial grasp of letters with no teacher and no proper materials was uncommon enough that it would have surprised Secundus himself, had he ever discovered the full extent of it rather than merely suspecting something was different about this slave. There is more to understand here about why Romans bathed the way they did in the first place, because it was never simply about cleanliness in the narrow sense we might assume. Roman medicine, inherited largely from Greek physicians and refined by contemporaries of Threptus's own era, like the physician Galen, understood the body through a theory of four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Heat and steam were believed to loosen and balance these humours, drawing out excess and restoring equilibrium, which meant that a visit to the caldarium was not merely a pleasant indulgence, but something closer to preventative medicine, recommended by physicians for ailments ranging from stiff joints to poor digestion. The sequence of rooms, cold plunge, warm room, hot room, and back again, was believed to shock and then soothe the body's systems in a manner thought genuinely therapeutic, not so different in spirit, if not in mechanism, from the cold plunges and sauna circuits people still pursue today for reasons that would sound entirely familiar to a Roman physician. There was also a simpler, more physical layer of health knowledge at work here, one that had nothing to do with humours or philosophy, and everything to do with observation repeated over generations. Romans understood, in a rough practical way, if not in the precise language germ theory would eventually supply, that dirt and standing filth bred sickness, and that clean water and heat seemed reliably to help wounds close and fevers break. This was folk wisdom refined by long trial and error rather than formal science. But it was not nothing, and it is part of why a town like Ostia invested so heavily in the machinery of bathing even before any physician's theory demanded it. The instinct came first. The theory of humours and the writings of men like Galen arrived afterward to explain, in the vocabulary available to them, why an instinct that already felt true actually seemed to work. Religion threaded through the building as well, quietly, the way it threaded through nearly everything in Roman life. A small shrine near the entrance of the Baths of Neptune, fitting for a building already named for the sea god given Ostia's identity as a harbour town, held a modest altar where bathers might leave a small offering, coin or a bit of incense, asking for protection from illness or simply giving thanks for the pleasure of the water. Other bathhouses across the empire kept shrines to Fortuna, goddess of luck, or to Asclepius and his daughter Hygeia, deities of healing and health respectively, acknowledging in stone and incense what the physicians acknowledged in their prescriptions, that bathing sat somewhere at the intersection of pleasure, medicine, and faith. Three things Romans rarely bothered separating from one another the way we tend to now. For a great many ordinary Romans, the baths also functioned as the closest thing to medical care they would ever receive. A trained physician, someone versed in Galen's writings, or the Hippocratic tradition behind them, was an expense reserved mostly for the wealthy, who might be visited at home for a private consultation. Dock worker with aching joints or a labouring mother recovering her strength had no such option, and so the shared, affordable ritual of heat, sweat, and cold plunge became, for most of the population, both spa and clinic. The one place a person of modest means could reliably seek some relief for the ordinary aches that accumulated over a hard working life. Life in Ostia was by any modern measure short and often difficult, illness and injury a constant companion rather than an occasional visitor, and a building that offered even a partial temporary sense of bodily relief earned its place at the center of the town's affection. None of this reached Threptus in any form he would have called religion or medicine. He did not visit the shrine. He did not receive the therapeutic benefit of the caldarium's heat, despite producing every degree of it with his own labor. What he received instead was the practical, unglamorous underside of these same beliefs, the understanding shared by everyone above him in the household's hierarchy that heat was valuable, that it mattered enough to justify considerable expense and considerable human cost. The philosophy of the caldarium and the physical reality of the Praefernium were, in the end, two ends of the same rope. and Threptus held the end that nobody upstairs ever had to think about. One more thread belongs here, a small one, about the language spoken inside these walls. Ostia's population included enough Greek speakers, traders, freedmen, educated slaves, that Greek phrases moved easily through the baths alongside Latin, sometimes within the same sentence. Threptus's own name, Greek in origin, marked him as part of this layered linguistic world without his ever having chosen it. A small inherited fact about identity that shaped how others addressed him, and in its own quiet way, hinted at a family history several generations back. Names, like buildings, carried histories inside them that most people never paused to read. The afternoon crowd, meanwhile, has reached its peak, and it is time we return to him. The afternoon at its height is the hardest stretch of Threptus's entire day, harder even than the pre-dawn hours of hauling wood in the dark, because it is the stretch with the least room for error. The caldarium is full. The tepidarium is full. Every heated surface in the building is being asked, continuously, to give up its warmth to hundreds of bodies at once. And the only way that warmth continues to exist is if the fire below keeps producing it at exactly the rate it is being consumed above. Faustus manages the balance the way a sailor manages wind, reading small signs, the sound of the flames, the color of the coals, the faint shift in how the testudo's water moves, and calling out to Threptus and Callias when more wood is needed, or when, occasionally, the fire has climbed too high and needs to be allowed to settle rather than fed further. It is 4:15 in the afternoon, and the crowd upstairs has begun, almost imperceptibly at first, to thin. The light through the high clerestory windows of the caldarium has shifted from the flat white of midday to something warmer, and the bathers who remain are the ones in less of a hurry, magistrates and merchants who have made the baths as much a social occasion as a hygienic one, lingering over the day's last conversations before the walk home. Below, crew begins the long, careful process of easing the fire back, not extinguishing it, never extinguishing it entirely, but reducing the fresh timber added with each pass, so that by the time the doors finally close for the evening, the roaring blaze of midday will have settled into something closer to a steady, moderate burn. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told, because it lacks the drama of the morning's crisis or the crush of the afternoon's crowd. It is simply hours of sustained, unglamorous attention, the kind of labor that produces nothing visible or memorable in itself, and is only ever noticed in its absence. A fire allowed to die too early leaves patrons shivering in a caldarium that has gone cold. A fire fed too aggressively, too late, wastes wood that costs Nicephorus real money and produces heat nobody is left to enjoy. Getting it right, hour after hour, day after day, for years on end the way Faustus has, is a skill nobody upstairs would ever think to call a skill at all. At the 10th hour, close to what we would call 4 in the afternoon, by our own reckoning, the bronze disc rings its final pattern of the day, and the great doors of the baths of Neptune begin to close to new arrivals. Bathers already inside are given time to finish, to dry themselves, to dress again in the apoditarium under Rufus's watchful eye, as he returns each patron's tunic and toga from the chest he has guarded since midday. The vendors who sold sausages and pastries near the entrance begin packing their carts. Within the hour, the building that held hundreds of people at its peak holds almost none at all. Only the staff whose work is not finished, simply because the doors are closed. For Threptus, this is when the second half of his real labor begins, the labor of undoing everything the day required. The ash from the day's full burning has built up thick beneath the pile stacks, and someone must crawl back into that space, in heat still considerable even as the fire eases, and clear it before it chokes tomorrow's flames. Callias takes the western section this time, having graduated in the months since his arrival from simple wood hauling to the harder crawling work, and Threptus takes the eastern section, checking on the repair he and Faustus made that morning as he goes, running his fingers once more along the mortar joint and finding it to his quiet satisfaction solid and cool enough now to touch without pain. There is a certain sound down here in the evening that Threptus has come to listen for, almost without meaning to. The settling creak of brick as it cools and contracts for a day of expansion under heat. A low series of ticks and groans that move through the hypercos space. He used to find it unsettling in his first months at this work. Now, it has become something closer to a signal that the worst of the day is behind him, the sound of the machine winding down rather than winding up. Somewhere above, muffled by the same brick and packed floor that muffles everything else Threptus experiences of the building's public life, comes the deep, resonant boom of the bronze entrance doors swinging shut for the night, followed by the lighter clank of the bar dropped into place across them. It is a sound Threptus has learned to feel almost as much as hear, a low vibration passing through stone before it reaches the ear properly, and it marks the true end of the day as clearly as any bell or shadow could. Whatever the last magistrates and merchants were discussing in the tepidarium, whatever business or gossip carried them past the closing hour, has now been carried out into the evening street along with them, leaving the building entirely to the people who keep it standing. By the time full darkness has settled over Ostia, the fires have been banked to a low, steady bed of red coals, enough to keep the water in the testudo from going fully cold overnight without demanding the constant feeding of daytime, and Threptus is finally permitted to step out of the crawl space for the last time that day. He climbs the half flight of stone steps into the delivery yard, and the air that meets him there, ordinary night air, faintly salted from the nearby sea, carrying none of the smoke or ash that has filled his lungs since before dawn, feels almost like a different substance entirely. He stands there longer than he strictly needs to, letting it move through him, and there is a small, private pleasure in this moment that nobody assigned to him and nobody would think to record, the simple relief of a body finally allowed to be cool. Faustus and Callias join him a few minutes later, all three of them filthy in the exact way that only a full day at this work produces, ash worked so deeply into their skin and hair that a casual observer might mistake it for their natural coloring. None of them speak much. There is a kind of quiet that settles over people who have spent the same hours doing the same difficult thing together, a companionship that does not require conversation to be real. Secundus meets them briefly in the yard, wax tablet in hand one final time, tallying the day's wood against what remains in the stacks, and tells them, without much ceremony, that tomorrow's delivery is expected before the 4th hour, and that the eastern repair should be checked again in a week's time to be certain it has held. Before dinner, there is a stretch of perhaps a quarter of an hour that Threptus has come, quietly, to think of as his own, though nobody has ever granted it to him formally, and nobody would take it away if they noticed. It falls between the last of the evening's duties and the moment Secundus locks the woodyard gate for the night, and in it, Threptus often walks the short distance to the low wall separating the delivery yard from the street, leans against the sun-warmed stone, and simply watches Ostia settle into evening. Shopkeepers are pulling their wooden shutters closed along the street of the corn measurers. A lamplighter moves slowly from one public torch bracket to the next, feeding each flame in turn. Somewhere nearby, a mother calls a child in for the night in a tone that carries the worn-down exhaustion of a long day, rather than any real urgency. None of this belongs to him in any sense the law would recognize, and yet in this narrow window between labor and sleep, it is difficult not to feel some quiet, unclaimed ownership over the simple fact of watching a town he has never had the freedom to wander through. Dinner, such as it is, comes from the same small ration that has fed Threptus every evening of his working life here. Bread, a portion of lentil or bean pottage kept warm near the kitchen's own small fire, a cup of watered wine. It is not a meal anyone would call generous, but it is enough. And there are evenings, this one among them, when Rufus finds a reason to pass through the service corridor after his own duties end and leaves behind a small extra portion, an apple gone slightly soft, a heel of finer bread than the crew's usual allowance, without comment. Without waiting to be thanked. Afterward, in the last hour before sleep claims him, Threptus does the one thing that belongs entirely to himself. He finds a patch of ash in the corner of the woodyard, smooths it flat with his palm, the way he has done most evenings for the better part of a year, and traces, slowly, the letters he has managed to learn so far. A few names, a handful of numerals, the beginning of a word he is still working out the meaning of. Faustus, watching from the doorway of their shared cell, no longer asks him what he is doing. He simply nods, the small, tired nod of a man who has stopped believing in much for himself, but has not entirely stopped believing in it for someone younger than him, and goes inside to sleep. Threptus follows a short while later, lying down on a straw mattress that never quite loses the smell of wood smoke, no matter how long it airs. His body aching in the specific pattern it aches every night. Shoulders first, then knees, then the base of his spine. Above him, in rooms he has never once entered, and never will, the marble floors of the baths of Neptune are finally cooling too, settling into the same quiet the whole town is settling into, and for a few hours, the only fire still burning anywhere in the building is the low bed of coals, keeping watch over a building full of sleeping stone. This is one of those moments where a small detail, the newness of certain bricks in that eastern wall Threptus and Faustus repaired, tells a considerably larger story about the world their small building sat inside. The baths of Neptune were not old, not by the standards of a town as old as Ostia itself. Construction had begun under the Emperor Hadrian, a ruler famous for his own restless love of architecture, and the building had only been completed and formally dedicated a handful of years before this very day. Whose name appeared on inscriptions near the entrance that Threptus had never learned to read, and likely never would. The mosaic of Neptune driving his chariot through the waves, the one visitors stopped to admire on their way into the changing rooms, was newer still, its black and white tiles barely settled into the floor, its colors not yet dulled by the thousands of bare feet that would eventually cross it over the coming century. This mattered because Threptus's short life had happened to coincide with something close to the high tide of a genuine building boom, one that had been gathering momentum across the empire for several generations by his time, and would continue gathering it for at least 2 more centuries after his death. Public bathhouses of one size or another had become, by the middle of the 2nd century, almost a required feature of Roman civic identity, present not only in great cities like Rome itself, but in modest provincial towns across Gaul, Hispania, North Africa, the eastern provinces, wherever Roman administration and Roman money reached. A town without a bath was, in the eyes of its own citizens, and certainly in the eyes of visitors, a town that had not yet arrived. Emperors competed, in a sense, for the scale and splendor of their contributions to this trend, and later rulers whom Threptus would never live to see, Septimius Severus, then Caracalla, then Diocletian, would eventually build Thermae on a scale that made even the impressive baths of Neptune look almost modest by comparison. Vast imperial complexes in Rome itself, covering dozens of acres and employing hypercost systems many times the size of the one Threptus, crawled through every day of his working life. Some of what made this boom possible sat in the ground itself, long before any slave ever fed a fire. Roman builders working anywhere near the Bay of Naples had access to a volcanic ash called pozzolana, which, mixed with lime and rubble, produced a concrete strong enough to set even underwater and durable enough that portions of it still stand 2,000 years later. This material, more than any single architect's genius, is what allowed Roman engineers to vault enormous ceilings over rooms the size of the baths of Neptune's caldarium without a forest of interior columns breaking up the space. And it is part of why a visitor standing in that room felt a sense of soaring openness that earlier, no-bore, timber-dependent civilizations could never have managed. The empire's bathing culture, in other words, rested quite literally on the geology beneath its feet, a fact as invisible to the average bather as the furnace room itself. None of that scale was possible without an equally significant, equally invisible achievement running underneath the entire enterprise, one that predates the furnace room by miles rather than feet. Ostia's water did not simply appear in the cisterns feeding the baths. It arrived by aqueduct channeled from springs and reservoirs some distance inland, carried along carefully graded stone and lead conduits engineered to maintain a steady, gentle downward slope across miles of countryside, using nothing but gravity and remarkable precision in surveying to move enormous volumes of water. It is worth pausing over how much quiet genius sat behind a system that most Romans, including most of the men lounging in the caldarium above Threptus's head, never once considered. Water simply arrived the way heat simply radiated from the marble. Both miracles of engineering rendered invisible by their own success. There was a broader current running beneath all of this too, one worth naming plainly. Manumission, the freeing of a slave by an owner's own choice, had become common enough across the empire by Threptus's century that Roman law had developed an entire body of rules just to govern it. Minimum ages an owner had to reach before freeing a slave, restrictions on how many slaves could be freed in a single will. Formal ceremonies conducted before a magistrate that converted a piece of property into a citizen in the space of a single afternoon. Some owners freed slaves out of genuine affection, built over years of shared household life. Others did it as a calculated reward for loyal service, a way of extracting maximum effort from a workforce that knew freedom might eventually be the prize for it. Still, others freed slaves who had grown too old or too injured to be worth feeding, a considerably less generous motive, dressed in the same legal paperwork. Nicephorus himself stood as living proof that the system, deeply slanted against the enslaved from the outset, was not entirely closed. He had walked through that door once. Whether Threptus ever would remain on this night, still an open question. The other change worth noting, quieter still and slower moving than any aqueduct, was happening not in stone, but in law. And it touched Threptus's own situation more directly than anything else in this deep dive. Antoninus Pius, the same emperor, whose name graced the newly finished baths above him, issued rulings during his reign that nudged Roman law, however modestly, toward recognizing some minimal claim a slave might have to protection from arbitrary cruelty. An owner who killed a slave without legitimate cause could now, at least in principle, face consequences under the law in a way that earlier generations of Roman jurists had never troubled themselves to codify. An owner whose treatment of a slave was judged excessively harsh could, in certain circumstances, be compelled to sell that slave to someone else. These were narrow protections, unevenly enforced, offering Threptus no immediate change to the 12 hours he spent crawling through smoke each day. But they mark, if you look at the long arc of Roman law rather than any single year of it, a direction of travel, a slow and halting acknowledgement that the people doing this labor were not, in fact, purely instruments to be used, however their owners saw fit. The trajectory of the buildings themselves tells its own quiet story about where this culture was heading. The baths of Neptune, grand as they felt to Threptus, and to every bather who walked its halls, were still fundamentally a leased civic enterprise, dependent on a private operator's willingness to shoulder the daily cost in exchange for the entrance fees. The colossal imperial thermae that later emperors built in Rome would abandon that model almost entirely, funded directly from the treasury and offered to the public at costs so low they amounted to a state gift, monuments to imperial generosity on a scale no single freedman leaseholder could ever hope to match. Bathing, across the span of just a few generations, was drifting steadily from a civic institution partly shaped by private profit towards something closer to a state-sponsored right of citizenship itself. One more small adjustment on the long, slow grade Roman society. It would be centuries yet before anything resembling the abolition of slavery reached the Mediterranean world, and it would be wrong, and a disservice to the honesty this evening deserves, to suggest that Threptus's life was meaningfully easier because an emperor in Rome had signed a ruling he likely never heard about. But history rarely moves in dramatic leaps. It moves the way the aqueduct water moved, by a gentle, almost imperceptible grade, one careful adjustment at a time, across a distance too long for any single person living through it to see the whole of. Threptus would not live to see slavery ended. He might, if his own hope for literacy and a useful skill ever bore fruit, live to see his own peculium grow large enough to purchase his freedom. And if he did, his children, born free rather than enslaved, would grow up in a legal world subtly, incrementally different from the one that had shaped his own childhood. That was the scale on which change moved in his lifetime. Not revolutions. Adjustments, each one small enough to go unnoticed by the person living through it, and large enough, given a century or two to accumulate, to eventually remake the shape of the world entirely. It is worth remembering, too, that Ostia itself would not last forever, in the form Threptus knew it. The harbor would eventually silt up over the following centuries, the river shifting its course the way rivers do, and the great port would slowly lose its purpose, as ships found other channels into the capital, leaving behind the very ruins that archaeologists would spend centuries carefully excavating, brick by brick, hypocaust by hypocaust, uncovering the shape of a furnace room that had once been as ordinary and unremarkable as any workplace in the ancient world, and would only become remarkable much later, once enough time had passed to make even ordinary labor feel like a discovery. For now, though, on this night, none of that future has arrived yet. The fire is banked, the building is cooling, and a 17-year-old boy sleeps in a small room beside a woodpile, unaware that the small ruling of an emperor he will never meet has already quietly shifted the ground beneath his life by some fraction of a degree, the way heat shifts through brick, slowly. We began this evening with a promise that by the end of it you would see a Roman bath differently than you did before, and it is worth checking that promise now against everything we have actually watched together. The night has grown late, and it is a good hour for stepping back rather than pressing forward to new detail. Let us step back now from this single day, from the fire and the ash and the small kindness of a heel of bread passed between two young men who understood each other without needing to speak, and look at what the whole of it adds up to. A day like Threptus's is never only itself. It is also a window, and if you look through it carefully enough, certain patterns become visible that a single afternoon, taken alone, would never fully reveal. The first and most obvious pattern is the invisibility of labor, and we have circled it all evening because it sits at the very center of this story. The marble floor of the caldarium was never simply marble. It was marble plus fire, plus a boy on his hands and knees clearing ash in the dark. And yet only one term of that equation was ever visible to the people standing on it. It was, in a very real sense, the entire design brief of the building. Architects and engineers spent real ingenuity ensuring that the mechanism of comfort stayed hidden beneath the experience of comfort, that Priscus, discussing grain prices with his colleagues, never had to see, hear, or smell the process that kept his feet warm. We tend to assume invisibility happens by accident, that some things simply go unnoticed. Here, invisibility was engineered as carefully as the hypocaust itself, brick by brick, precisely because a visible furnace room would have disturbed the very leisure it existed to provide. Consider, for a moment, how thoroughly this pattern shaped the physical building itself. Every design choice that made the caldarium feel serene, the absence of visible smoke, the silence of the fire, the seamless warmth rising through stone that seemed to have no source, required someone downstairs to solve a genuinely difficult engineering problem and then hide the solution from view entirely. We rarely think of concealment as a form of skilled labor in its own right. Yet an enormous amount of Roman craft went into making sure that Threptus's world and Priscus's world never had to acknowledge one another directly, connected only by 2 feet of brick and the accident of standing in the same building at the same hour. The second pattern is the performance of luxury as a marker of status, which turns out to be a more layered thing than it first appears. The quadrant's entrance fee made the Baths of Neptune look, on its surface, like one of the more democratic institutions the Roman world produced, a place where a dock worker and a magistrate paid nearly the same coin to walk through the same door. But status found other ways to assert itself once inside, through the number of slaves in a patron's entourage, through unhurried hours a wealthy man could spend that a laboring man could not spare, through separate hours set aside for women and men that quietly encoded a whole set of assumptions. Equality at the threshold and hierarchy inside the building were not, it turns out, in any contradiction. They coexisted easily, the way many unequal systems manage to preserve an appearance of fairness at exactly the point where it costs the powerful the least to grant it. You can see this same pattern in the smaller details we passed over quickly earlier in the evening. The segregated bathing hours that gave women a narrower and less convenient slice of the day, the private balnea that let the wealthiest families opt out of shared space entirely while still, when it suited them, enjoying the public building's grander pleasures. Status in Ostia was rarely announced with a sign or a declaration. It was built into the architecture of time and space itself, into who got which hour, which room, which level of privacy, so thoroughly that most people living inside the arrangement never had reason to name it as a system at all. It simply felt like the natural order of a morning. The third pattern is the mediated nature of comfort itself, the way an entire experience can be manufactured for someone without that person ever perceiving the manufacturing. Priscus felt warmth. He did not feel labor, wood, smoke, ash, or the particular ache of a body that has spent 12 hours bent nearly double in a space built for someone half his size. What reached him was the finished product of an enormous chain of human effort, refined and filtered until only the pleasant part remained. This is not unique to Roman bathhouses. It is closer to a universal feature of how comfort has always been distributed across unequal societies. The pleasant surface delivered to some, the underlying cost absorbed quietly by others. The distance between the two carefully maintained by architecture, custom, or simple habit of not asking. The fourth pattern is the economics of appearance, the way an entire town could organize itself, generation after generation, around sustaining a visible marvel, while the invisible cost of that marvel stripped hillsides, exhausted laborers. Nicephorus profited. Town council gained prestige. Priscus gained an afternoon of pleasant conversation on warm marble. Nobody in that chain of benefit had any particular reason to ask what it cost, because the cost had been so thoroughly displaced onto people whose complaints, even if voiced, carried no weight in the ledgers that mattered. You could trace this same pattern forward across the centuries with very little effort, from the stripped hillsides around Ostia to any modern instance of a beautiful, efficient system whose environmental or human cost has simply been priced somewhere else, somewhere far enough away that the people enjoying the benefit never have to reconcile the two halves of the ledger in their own mind. A historian looking back at any century, including your own, would need very little imagination to recognize the shape of it. Only the commodities change. The fifth pattern, and perhaps the gentlest one to end on, is the persistence of striving even inside systems built to deny it any outlet. Threptus had almost nothing that belonged entirely to him. Not his time, not his labor, not even, in the full legal sense, his own body. And yet, he had found in the ash of a woodyard nobody else valued. A way to practice a skill that might, slowly, against fairly narrow odds, widen the small space of choice available to him. It is a small fact, but it reorganizes the whole picture if you sit with it. Systems of severe constraint rarely succeed in extinguishing the human impulse toward hope entirely. They only succeed in narrowing where that hope can find a foothold, pushing it into corners as small and unlikely as a patch of ash beside a woodpile where it survives anyway, because that seems to be one of the more stubborn facts about people in every century we have any record of. There is a sixth thing worth naming, quieter than the other five, and easy to walk past without noticing. And it concerns the small acts of kindness that survived inside all of this anyway. Rufus, slipping bread through a side door. Faustus's tired nod toward a boy tracing letters in ash. None of these gestures dismantled the system that made them necessary in the first place, and it would be a mistake to romanticize them into something larger than they were. But they mattered to the people involved, and they suggest something worth holding on to, that even inside arrangements built to treat people as instruments, the instruments kept finding small, stubborn ways to treat each other as people instead. That fact does not redeem the system. It simply tells you something true about the humans caught inside it. Taken together, these patterns do not describe a Roman peculiarity so much as a human one, dressed in togas and heated marble, rather than whatever clothing your own century happens to favor. Every comfortable surface most of us stand on today rests on some labor we have simply stopped noticing. Whether it happens in a warehouse, a server room, a kitchen, or a supply chain stretched halfway around the world. The baths of Neptune are gone now, their furnace cold for the better part of 2,000 years. But the architecture of invisible labor they represent so clearly has never entirely left us. It has only changed its bricks. Let us go back to him one last time, because a story like this should end where it began, in the small room beside the woodpile, rather than in the grand rooms upstairs. It is well past the middle of the night now, the hour when even a port town as busy as Ostia allows itself something close to true quiet. The dock workers who load ships by torchlight have not yet begun their shift. The bakers have not yet lit their ovens for the morning's bread. Somewhere out past the harbor mouth, the sea moves against the breakwater in the same steady rhythm it has kept for longer than any building in this town, longer than the empire itself, a sound that reaches faintly into the delivery yard and settles over everything like a second, gentler kind of silence. Threptus sleeps on his straw mattress. Faustus, a few feet away, already deep in the kind of exhausted, dreamless rest that 11 years of this labor teaches a body to fall into quickly. Callias curled smaller than either of them, still young enough that sleep takes him almost the instant he allows it to. The cell smells the way it always smells, ash and old smoke and the close, warm press of 3 bodies sharing too small a space, and none of them would recognize it as anything worth commenting on, because it is simply the smell of home, whatever else that word might mean to people who own so little of their own lives. Above them, through the thickness of brick and packed earth, the baths of Neptune have gone fully quiet for the first time since before dawn. The mosaic of Neptune and his sea creatures lies in complete darkness, now invisible to anyone. The black and white tiles, no different in the dark than any other stretch of floor, waiting for tomorrow's first grey light to make them beautiful again. The caldarium's marble, so warm at midday that Priscus never thought twice about it, has cooled by now to something closer to the temperature of the night air itself. The water in the pools gone still and flat, undisturbed by a single hand. The fire that made all of it possible sits banked in the Prefernium, exactly as Threptus left it, a shallow bed of red coals, breathing slowly in the dark, giving off just enough warmth to keep the Testudo's water from turning fully cold before the crew returns to build the blaze back up in a few hours' time. On the small shelf in the service corridor, tucked behind the loose brick only Threptus knows to check, the iron writing rod waits for tomorrow evening, the same patient way it waited for this one. And in Secundus's cramped office near the entrance to the service level, the wax tablet sits closed for the night, though it already holds scratched into its blackened surface in the overseer's economical hand everything tomorrow will require of the 3 sleeping men down the corridor. Wood delivery expected before the 4th hour, the Eastern repair to be checked again within the week. The women's session to open at the usual time, the men's to follow, the fires to climb and hold and ease exactly as they climbed and held and eased today, and as they will climb and hold and ease the day after that, for as long as the baths of Neptune stand and someone is willing to feed what burns beneath them. This is the quiet, stubborn shape of most ordinary lives, across most of history, not a single dramatic turn, but a wheel that keeps returning to the same position, one day folding into the next, almost before the first has finished, the obligations of tomorrow already written down before tonight's exhaustion has even fully settled into the bones. Threptus does not know, asleep as he is, that an emperor's small ruling has shifted the ground beneath him by some fraction of a degree, or that his own quiet hours with a stick and a patch of ash might, if fortune ever leans his way, eventually carry him somewhere his labor alone never could. He only knows, in whatever wordless way a sleeping body knows anything, that the fire held today, that the floor did not give way, that tomorrow will ask the same of him again, and that for now, for these few hours, nothing more is required of him than rest. There is a version of this story that ends with triumph, with Threptus buying his freedom, learning his letters fully, becoming the kind of man whose name survives on an inscription somewhere, for us to find nearly 2,000 years later. I would like to tell you that version is true. I do not know that it is. The historical record that gives us people like Threptus at all is thin and scattered, built more from the shape of the systems they lived inside than from any surviving account of how any single one of their stories ended. And honesty requires admitting that most nights like this one simply led to more mornings exactly like it, for years, for a whole lifetime, without any dramatic turn at all. What I can tell you is that he was real, in the sense that thousands of boys just like him were real, that this exact labor was performed by exact hands on an exact night, much like this one, somewhere beneath the marble floors that history remembers so much more easily. Consider before you let sleep take you the rest of the way. Whatever fires you tended today, the obligations you carried that nobody upstairs, so to speak, ever had to think about. The invisible labor that made someone else's afternoon feel easy. It is worth naming, if only to yourself, in the dark, the way Threptus might have named it if he had ever had the words for it. And then you can set it down the way he finally got to set his own work down, for a few hours at least, before the wheel turns again and asks the same of you tomorrow. Out past the delivery yard, the street itself has gone as quiet as it ever gets in a working port town. A single stray dog trotting past the shuttered bakery, a watchman somewhere off toward the forum calling the hour to no one at all, his own voice. Even the gulls have settled, tucked into whatever ledges and rooftops gulls prefer for sleeping, leaving the harbor to the slow creak of moored ships shifting against their ropes. It is, in its own way, as peaceful an hour as this town ever offers anyone, rich or poor, free or enslaved. And for these few hours at least, the town does not trouble itself much over which of its sleeping residents belongs to which category. Ostia sleeps around him. The harbor sleeps, its ships resting at anchor until the tide and the dock workers wake them. The baths of Neptune sleep, marble and brick and mosaic and hidden furnace room, all cooling together under the same dark sky. Their grand rooms and their humble crawl space finally, briefly, sharing the same silence rather than being divided by 2 feet of stone. Somewhere in that shared darkness, a fire holds itself at a low, patient glow, doing the only thing it has ever been asked to do, waiting for morning and for the hands that will come, as they always come, to build it back into something worth calling warmth. The fire has burned down to its last coals now, here, in this room, as well as in the one we visited tonight. The story is finished, at least for this evening. But the boy was real, or as real as a composite of many boys like him can be made across the distance of 18 centuries. And he lived, and worked, and hoped in small, quiet ways that nobody thought to record at the time. You have spent a few hours in his world now. That is not nothing. Sleep well, friend, wherever this finds you. The lamps are going out, and the house, at last, is still.